I had always thought our relationship was perfect. Alex and I had been together for over 3 years, and in those years, we had built something that seemed unshakable. He was everything I had ever wanted: handsome, attentive, kind, and supportive. I trusted him with all my heart, and he had always made me feel secure. We had our little routine: mornings together before work, casual evenings watching our favorite shows, long walks in the park on weekends. We never argued. We were the kind of couple that friends admired, the kind that everyone believed would never fall apart. But recently, something had begun to shift. It wasn't dramatic, not a glaring issue, but there was a subtle distance between us. At first, I told myself it was just the stress of work, or maybe I was just being paranoid. Alex had been a little distant, but I attributed it to the fact that he had been working long hours at the office. He had always been the type to throw himself into his work, and I had no reason to believe this time would be any different. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off. It was during a quiet evening when the first seed of doubt was planted. We had just finished dinner, and I was sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone. Alex was beside me, but he wasn't paying much attention. His eyes were glued to the TV, but his mind didn't seem to be there. I caught myself staring at him for a moment, wondering what was going on in his mind. Had I done something wrong? Was he losing interest in me? The thought made my stomach churn, but I quickly pushed it aside. He loved me, right? That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and I could hear Alex's steady breathing beside me. I wanted to reach out and touch him, to feel that connection we once had. But something held me back, a hesitation I couldn't quite place. He had always been the one to initiate things, and while I still loved him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on different wavelengths. Was this just a phase, or was something deeper at play? Over the next few weeks, my insecurities started to grow. I noticed the little things: the way Alex would sometimes glance at his phone when I wasn't around, or how he would lose himself in his thoughts during our conversations. There were no more spontaneous touches, no more lingering kisses when we said goodbye in the morning. It was like the intimacy between us had slowly faded into something routine, something functional. I began to wonder if it was me, if I wasn't doing enough to keep the spark alive. Maybe I was too complacent, too comfortable with the idea that love would always be enough to keep us together. I began to second-guess myself. Was I too demanding? Too needy? I started picking apart every little thing I did, searching for ways I might have pushed him away. I told myself I wasn't being irrational, that there had to be a reason for the distance between us. But the more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Nothing seemed to make sense. And then one evening, Alex said something that changed everything. We were having dinner when he mentioned something about a woman at work who had been flirting with him. It was an offhand comment, something he didn't think much of, but it cut through me like a knife. I had always trusted Alex, never doubting his loyalty, but hearing him speak so casually about another woman left a bad taste in my mouth. I told myself it was no big deal, that it was just harmless office banter. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder, was this the beginning of something more? Was this the first sign that something was changing in him? The seed of doubt that had been planted weeks ago began to grow into a full-fledged worry. The thought that he might be interested in someone else gnawed at me, but I kept it to myself. I didn't want to seem paranoid. I didn't want to acknowledge the fear growing in the pit of my stomach. Then, one Saturday afternoon, I made a decision that would unknowingly set the course for everything that was about to happen. I was getting ready to meet some friends for coffee, and I decided to wear a mini skirt, something I hadn't worn in a long time. I had been feeling a little stuck, and the idea of doing something spontaneous, something different, made me feel alive again. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I felt a rush of confidence. The skirt was a little more daring than what I was used to, but it made me feel good. As I was about to leave, Alex walked into the room, and his gaze immediately locked onto me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes just lingered on me, tracing the lines of the skirt, my legs, and then back to my face. I saw the shift in him. His expression softened, and his usual aloofness seemed to vanish. It was like I had caught his attention in a way I hadn't in a long time. He looked at me differently, and for a brief moment, It felt like we were back to where we started, when we couldn't keep our eyes off each other. "Wow," he said, his voice low. "You look amazing." The compliment made me smile, but something in the way he said it felt different. It wasn't just a compliment. It felt like a spark, like a flicker of something he hadn't noticed in me in a while. His eyes stayed on me a little too long, and I noticed a change in the way he looked at me, something intense, almost possessive. For the first time in weeks, I felt like he was seeing me again, really seeing me. But I also felt a subtle shift. Was he noticing me more because of the skirt, or was it something else? As I left for my coffee date, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of excitement. For the first time in a while, I felt noticed. I felt wanted. And as I stepped out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us, that the attention I had been craving from Alex was finally being given to me. Little did I know, that moment would set off a chain of events that would change everything. The moment I walked out the door, I felt a strange excitement bubble up inside me. It wasn't just the thrill of wearing something I hadn't worn in ages. It was the reaction I had gotten from Alex. His gaze had lingered longer than usual, and the compliment had felt more sincere, more intense. I couldn't help but wonder what had changed in him. Had he been so caught up in his routine that he had stopped noticing me? Or was it something about that mini skirt, something about the way I had stepped outside of my usual comfort zone? Either way, something shifted in the air between us. As I arrived at the cafe, I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched. My friends were already there, chatting away, but I couldn't help but notice that every glance I caught in the mirror seemed to reaffirm the confidence that had surged through me earlier. I wasn't sure if it was the skirt or the attention, but for the first time in a while, I felt alive. The day went by in a blur of laughter and lighthearted conversation, but my mind kept drifting back to Alex. There was a tug in my chest, a curiosity that wouldn't let me go. I hadn't seen him look at me like that in months, and it made me wonder why. Did I look different? Did he see something in me that he had been missing? That night, when I returned home, Alex was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to his phone. He barely acknowledged my presence, and my confidence from earlier started to fade. The effect of the skirt had worn off, replaced by the cold, familiar distance I had become accustomed to. But the days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. I couldn't ignore the growing distance between Alex and me, nor could I stop the unsettling thought that something had changed. The more I tried to ignore it, the more I found myself questioning everything: our relationship, his feelings, my own desires. It was like I was walking on thin ice, unsure of which step would cause everything to collapse. Alex's behavior grew even more unpredictable. At times, he would act distant, his focus on his phone or the TV, while other times, his eyes would linger on me in a way that made me feel uncomfortable. It was as if he couldn't decide whether to ignore me or devour me with his gaze. I couldn't make sense of it, and the confusion gnawed at me. He was always so present before, so attentive. But now, he seemed like a stranger, a person who was physically there but emotionally absent. It wasn't just the way he looked at me, it was everything. I could sense the tension building between us, a gap that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. He was jealous, but not in the way I was used to. It wasn't the protective jealousy that came from love, it was possessiveness, as if he saw me more as an object to be controlled than a partner to be loved. And that made me question things I had never questioned before. Was I still seen as an individual in his eyes, or had I become just another possession? I tried to keep the peace, to ignore the discomfort gnawing at me, but every word, every glance from him felt loaded with something unspoken. There was a frustration in the air that we both refused to address. And in the silence between us, I began to notice something else, something I didn't want to admit. I was seeking attention elsewhere. Daniel, the co-worker I had run into earlier, kept popping into my mind. Our conversation at the store had been innocent enough, but the way he made me feel, the attention he gave me, was hard to shake. I realized that for the first time in a long time I felt truly seen. He wasn't distracted, he wasn't aloof, he was completely engaged. And that engagement, that feeling of being valued, was something I was missing from Alex. It wasn't intentional. I didn't set out to find someone else to fill the void, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the emotional distance between Alex and me had pushed me to seek validation elsewhere. I didn't need to be with someone else to feel fulfilled, but the desire for attention, for someone to see me the way I wanted to be seen, was undeniable. And it wasn't just Daniel anymore. I found myself enjoying the harmless flirtations at work, the extra attention from friends, the way men would look at me when I walked into a room. It wasn't about cheating, it was about feeling wanted, feeling special. And somewhere along the way, I had started to crave that feeling more than I wanted to admit. I told myself it was harmless. A few conversations here and there, a smile or two, nothing more than that. But I knew deep down it was becoming more. The line between friendly attention and emotional infidelity was starting to blur. I hadn't physically cheated, but emotionally, I was drifting away from Alex. I was seeking fulfillment in ways I hadn't before, and I could feel the guilt creeping in. I felt like I was betraying him, not through actions, but through my thoughts and desires. The more I sought validation outside of our relationship, the more distant Alex became, and the more I resented him for it. One evening, when I came home late from a dinner with friends, I found Alex sitting on the couch, his expression tense. He didn't say anything at first, but I could feel his gaze on me, the weight of it pressing down on me. He didn't ask where I'd been, but his silence spoke volumes. I was exhausted, but my mind was racing, caught between the guilt I felt for my actions and the frustration I had with him. He hadn't noticed me in months, and now that I had turned to others for attention, he was suddenly interested in my every move. "What's going on with you?" Alex finally asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. He had no idea, I realized. He didn't know that I had been feeling neglected, that his lack of attention had driven me to seek it elsewhere. I didn't want to admit it, not yet, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face the truth of what was happening. Instead, I deflected. "Nothing," I replied, offering a small smile. "Just a long day." But inside, I was torn. Part of me wanted to open up to him, to tell him everything, how I was feeling, how the distance between us had pushed me away, how I had sought attention from others. But another part of me was afraid. Afraid of what he might say, afraid of how he would react. The guilt was overwhelming, and the last thing I wanted was to make things worse. In the weeks that followed, I tried to focus on the relationship, to bridge the gap I felt growing between us. I made more effort to be affectionate, to initiate conversations, but it felt forced. The connection we once had seemed like a distant memory, something I couldn't quite reach no matter how hard I tried. Alex, too, seemed conflicted. He would sometimes pull me close, his arms around me, but I could sense the tension in his touch, as though we were both aware of the cracks in our relationship. It was like we were both trying to patch up something that couldn't be fixed, and the more I tried, the more I felt like I was failing. Despite everything, I found myself constantly thinking about Daniel. It wasn't just the attention he gave me, it was the ease with which he made me feel good about myself, something I hadn't felt in a long time with Alex. I wasn't in love with Daniel, but I was falling for the way he made me feel. And the more I thought about him, the more I realized how much I missed that feeling, the feeling of being desired, truly seen. The emotional betrayal had already started, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was okay. The tension between Alex and me had reached its peak. The constant unease, the unspoken words, and the growing distance were starting to take their toll. I could feel myself slipping further and further away from him, and the guilt that had once been buried deep inside was now impossible to ignore. I was no longer just physically distant from Alex. I was emotionally disconnected, and the realization hit me harder than I expected. I couldn't ignore the way I had been leaning on others for validation, how I had been searching for something outside of my relationship that I wasn't getting from Alex. It wasn't just harmless flirtation anymore. It was a need, a craving for attention and affection that I couldn't seem to get from the man I had once trusted completely. The reality of what I had been doing was impossible to escape, and I found myself standing on the precipice of a decision I wasn't ready to make but knew was coming. One evening, as I sat in the living room, Alex walked in and sat next to me. His presence felt different, colder, more distant. I knew he could feel it too, the unspoken divide that seemed to stretch further every day. He looked at me, his eyes searching, waiting for me to say something. I could tell he was on the verge of confronting me, but he hesitated, unsure of how to bring it up. He had always been the one to avoid conflict, the one who shied away from uncomfortable truths. But I could feel the storm brewing, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it would all come crashing down. "Is there